There is a voice inside your head that has been talking to you your entire life. You should be further along by now. You should be more disciplined. You should be kinder, more patient, less reactive. You should handle things better. You should need less from other people. You should be, by now, someone different from who you actually are. You probably recognize this voice. Most people do. What most people do not know is that Karen Horney, one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century, spent her career studying exactly where that voice comes from, what it does to you, and why listening to it is making your life smaller instead of larger. In this video, we will look at what she discovered and why the version of yourself that you think you should be may be the thing standing most directly in the way of who you actually are. Stay with me. Karen Horney was a German-American psychoanalyst who worked in the first half of the 20th century. She was one of the first major voices to challenge the dominance of Freudian psychology, not by dismissing it, but by insisting that Freud had been looking in the wrong direction. Where Freud focused on biological drives and the deep past, Horney looked at something more immediate and, she argued, more consequential, the way we relate to ourselves. Her central observation was both simple and devastating. Most people spend their lives at war with themselves, not with their circumstances, not with other people, with themselves. And the primary weapon in that war is what she called the tyranny of the shoulds. The shoulds are not occasional self-improvement reminders. They are a comprehensive internal system of demands, a rigid, relentless list of what you must be, how you must feel, how you must perform, and who you must become. And crucially, the shoulds are never satisfied. You should be more productive. But when you become more productive, you should also be more present. When you become more present, you should also be more ambitious. When you become more ambitious, you should also be more calm. The list extends infinitely, always just far enough ahead of you that you can never catch it. Horney observed that people under the tyranny of the shoulds do not experience this as self-imposed. They experience it as simply knowing what is right, as having standards, as caring about improvement. The cruelty of the tyranny is that it disguises itself as virtue. But underneath the language of self-improvement is something else entirely. The implicit belief that who you actually are is not enough, that your real feelings are not the right feelings, that your actual capacities are not sufficient, that you, as you currently exist, are a problem to be solved. Horney gave this phenomenon a name. She called it the idealized self. The idealized self is not a healthy aspiration. It is an image constructed early in life, often unconsciously, of who you would have to become in order to be acceptable, to be loved, to be safe. It is not a vision of your best self. It is a vision of the self that you believe would finally deserve to exist. And the distance between that idealized self and your actual self is the source, Horney argued, of almost all neurotic suffering. To understand why the idealized self forms, Horney began with what she called basic anxiety. Basic anxiety is not the ordinary anxiety of daily life, the nervousness before a presentation, the worry about a specific outcome. It is something deeper and more fundamental, a pervasive early sense that the world is unsafe and that you are alone in navigating it. This anxiety does not require dramatic trauma to develop. It requires only the absence of something, genuine warmth, consistent, unconditional affection. The experience of being valued not for what you do, but for simply existing. When a child does not receive this, and this is more common than most people realize, they develop a strategy. They construct an idea of what they would have to become in order to be safe, accepted, and loved. And they begin quietly and systematically, to pursue that image. The child who learns that they are loved when they are good becomes the adult who cannot tolerate their own anger. The child who learns that weakness is dangerous becomes the adult who is always fine, always managing, always competent. The child who learns that they are only interesting when they are exceptional becomes the adult who cannot rest. Each of these adaptations made perfect sense in its original context. They were survival strategies. The problem is that survival strategies do not automatically dissolve when the situation changes. They calcify. They become personality. They become the voice that says, "You should." Horney identified 3 broad strategies that people use to manage basic anxiety, 3 ways of orienting the self in relation to others. The first is moving toward people, the person who manages anxiety by seeking approval, by being agreeable, by making themselves indispensable, by needing to be needed. Their idealized self is someone endlessly loving, selfless, and good. The second is moving against people, the person who manages anxiety through control and strength, who must be the most capable, the most successful, the least dependent. Their idealized self is someone invulnerable and dominant. The third is moving away from people, the person who manages anxiety by withdrawing, by becoming self-sufficient, by needing very little and feeling nothing too intensely. Their idealized self is someone perfectly contained and free from need. None of these strategies is wrong in itself. All 3 are recognizable. Most people have elements of each. The problem, Horney argued, is when they harden into rigid compulsions when you cannot choose which way to move because the anxiety moves you for you. Here is what the tyranny of the shoulds actually looks like in daily life, not in dramatic breakdowns, but in the ordinary texture of how people experience themselves. It looks like finishing a piece of work and feeling, not satisfaction, but immediate evaluation. Was it good enough? Could it have been better? What will people think? The capacity for rest is absent because the idealized self does not rest, it only performs. It looks like receiving a genuine compliment and being unable to fully receive it because the idealized self already knows what the person would think if they saw the parts you hide. So the compliment lands on the surface and does not go deeper. It looks like moments of real feeling grief, anger, need, longing that are immediately followed by a secondary judgment. I shouldn't feel this. I should be over this by now. I shouldn't need this much. The feeling is never just allowed to be what it is. It must be processed through the filter of what you should feel instead. It looks like a relationship in which you are genuinely generous, but cannot quite be genuinely present, because presence would require revealing the actual self, the one that does not always meet the standard. So you give without being seen, and wonder why you still feel alone. Horney was very precise about the mechanism here. The tyranny of the shoulds produces what she called the search for glory, the compulsive drive to close the gap between the real self and the idealized self through achievement, approval, or control. The search for glory is exhausting because the gap never actually closes. Every achievement is immediately absorbed into the baseline. Every approval is insufficient the moment it fades. Every demonstration of control is one failure away from collapse. But underneath the search for glory, Horney identified something even more painful: the despised self. Because if the idealized self is who you should be, and you are clearly not that, then the conclusion the psyche draws is that who you actually are, your real self, with its inconsistencies, its needs, its failures, its perfectly ordinary humanness, must be the problem. The self-criticism that follows is not, Horney argued, a search for improvement. It is self-punishment. It is the prosecution of the actual self for the crime of not being the idealized one. And people carry this prosecution internally, quietly, constantly, often without ever putting words to it. It simply lives as a persistent, low-level conviction. Something is wrong with me. At the center of Horney's work is a concept that is both simple and in practice radical: the real self. The real self is not an idealized version of you. It is not a fixed essence you must discover. It is, in Horney's description, that central inner force common to all human beings and yet unique in each, which is the deep source of growth. Growth, in her sense, is not the achievement of the idealized self. It is not becoming more productive, more admirable, more exceptional. It is the expansion of your honest relationship with your own experience, the capacity to feel what you actually feel, to want what you actually want, to be in contact with the reality of who you are, rather than the performance of who you should be. This sounds simple. It is not, because the real self has, in most people, been suppressed for so long that it has become difficult to hear. The tyranny of the shoulds is loud. The real self speaks quietly. Horney observed that people who begin to reconnect with the real self often experience it not as revelation, but as grief. Because the real self knows, without being told, how much has been spent performing, how many years of energy have gone into managing the gap, rather than living the life. But she also observed something more hopeful. The real self is not destroyed by the tyranny. It is merely buried. And unlike the idealized self, which demands that you become something other than what you are, the real self requires only that you pay attention to what is already there. Jung, whom we have met in a previous video, described a similar movement as individuation, the slow, ongoing process of becoming more fully yourself. Horney's language is different, but the direction is the same. Both understood that the most important psychological work is not the construction of a better self, but the honest encounter with the actual one. This is also what Fromm was pointing toward when he wrote about the capacity to love. It is impossible when the self-image is constructed rather than real, because constructed selves cannot be genuinely present to anyone, including themselves. The three ideas build on each other, and they all point to the same thing. Before we talk about what to do, it is worth pausing on a question that Horney took seriously. Why does the tyranny persist? If the shoulds are so exhausting, if the idealized self is impossible, if the search for glory never delivers what it promises, why doesn't the system simply collapse under its own weight? The answer is that it is protecting you from something that feels worse. The tyranny of the shoulds is, at its root, a defense against a very specific fear, the fear that if you stop performing, if you let the idealized self go, if you reveal the actual self in all its ordinariness and imperfection, you will be rejected, or more precisely, you will confirm the fear you have always had, that you are, at bottom, not enough. This is why the shoulds are so resistant to simple logic. You can know, intellectually, that your standards are unrealistic. You can understand, theoretically, that your self-criticism is disproportionate, and you can still not be able to stop, because the moment you ease the standard, the anxiety beneath it surfaces. Horney understood this. She did not prescribe simply letting go of the idealized self, as if it were a hat you could take off. She understood that it was built for a reason, that it was built by a person doing the best they could with what they had, and that it deserves to be approached with compassion before it can be released. What changes is not the presence of the anxiety, it is your relationship to it. Instead of managing it by becoming someone you are not, you learn to be curious about it. You begin to ask not, how can I become good enough to stop feeling this? But, what is this feeling telling me about what I actually need? This is the beginning of what Horney called self-realization. Not the achievement of a better self, but the gradual, honest recovery of the self that was always there. It does not happen quickly. It does not happen all at once. But it begins with a single, surprisingly difficult act: taking your own actual experience seriously, rather than judging it against a standard it was never meant to meet. You do not need to dismantle the idealized self today. That is not how this works. But there is one small thing you can do, not as a technique, but as an orientation. At some point today, you will have an experience that you immediately judge. You will feel something you think you should not feel. You will fail to meet a standard you have set for yourself. You will be less than the idealized version in some small, ordinary way. When that happens, and it will happen, instead of immediately moving to correct, suppress, or berate, try one thing: pause and ask yourself what the actual experience is. Not what it means, not what it says about you, not what you should do differently. Just, what is this exactly? What is the real thing that is happening here, beneath the judgment? Horney believed that this kind of attention, honest, non-punitive, genuinely curious, is how the real self begins to surface. Not through analysis, not through achievement, not through becoming better, simply through being willing to look at what is actually there. That willingness, practiced consistently, is what she meant by self-realization. And it is, she argued, the only path to a life that is genuinely your own. Not the life the shoulds prescribed, but the life that grows naturally from who you actually are. If something in this video found its way to a specific should in your own life, that is not accidental. These ideas have a way of landing in exactly the places that need them. Share this with someone who has been running from their own idealized self for a long time. Not to tell them something simply because the conversation that follows might be worth having. This is the fourth video in our series. Frankl showed us that meaning is what the self is built around. Fromm showed us that love is how the self encounters another. Jung showed us that the shadow is what the self refuses to see. And Horney shows us the prison the self builds for itself and what it looks like to walk out. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind, not to fill a feed, but to keep walking.